Welcome to the Open Wheel Show. My name's David, and in this episode, we're going to be covering part 3 of our F1 2020 grid introduction in terms of the cast of characters, teams, and drivers that are on the paddock. We're going to be covering 3 teams in this. It's the bottom 3 teams from the 2019 standings in order. That goes Alfa Romeo, Haas, and then Williams. We'll start off with Alfa Romeo, which is both one of the newest and one of the oldest teams on the grid, and it might be a little bit confusing, but Alfa Romeo dates back to the very beginning of Formula One as a constructor and a racing team. However, it didn't appear on the grid for vast stretches of time. The name Alfa Romeo only reappeared on the F1 grid as a sort of like main team name back in 2018. As they took over essentially the name of Sauber F1. Sauber has a long history in the sport, and the team is still basically Sauber. It's run by Sauber, it's run out of Sauber's factories, the team principle didn't change, basically just the name changed. Today, Alfa Romeo operates as a sort of de facto Ferrari B team to a much greater extent than other teams on the grid that we'll cover here in a second. One of the seats is determined by Alfa Romeo themselves, and then one of the seats is determined by Ferrari. The team principal over at Alfa Romeo is a guy by the name of Frédéric Vasseur, who is a French engineer who formerly served as the team principal at Renault back in 2016, and then moved to Sauber, which is now Alfa Romeo, in 2017. The current driver lineup consists of Kimi Räikkönen and Antonio Giovinazzi. Of those two, despite what you might think, given Kimi Räikkönen's history with Ferrari, the Ferrari seat at Alfa Romeo is actually Giovinazzi's seat because Giovinazzi is from the Ferrari Young Driver program. Kimi Räikkönen's seat is, technically speaking, anyways, the Alfa Romeo determined seat. We'll start with Kimi because he's my personal favorite driver of all time. I love Kimi Räikkönen. He's a Finnish driver and a former Formula One champion back in 2007 with Ferrari. He's actually, technically, the reigning Ferrari world champion because nobody has won a world championship with Ferrari since he did back in 2007. He actually took a break from Formula One at one point in his career to go take up rallying and has said in interviews last year that he's only doing Formula One because he considers it to be his hobby. He's, quite frankly, just the coolest guy in every way on the paddock, in my opinion. He's been called the Iceman for a really long time. He's raced with Lotus and McLaren in the past, but most famously with Ferrari and now at Alfa Romeo, which is, again, technically Sauber F1, which is actually where he started his career. So it's a nice little send-off for him to race there both last year and this year. It's anticipated that this is probably his last year, although he has not committed to any kind of retirement schedule. He has said essentially that he's going to keep racing in Formula One as long as it's fun for him. And of course, there's an implied as long as somebody will give him a drive, which I don't think he would ever be short of offers. They just might not be at very good teams. He's very comfortable at Alfa Romeo, though, which is based in Switzerland, because that's where Sauber obviously was based, and is actually just down the road from Kimi Räikkönen's house. So it's a really comfortable situation for him. I'm hoping that he sticks around for more. I really like Kimi. I think the grid is definitely going to miss him. I'm definitely going to have to do an episode all about Kimi at some point because the dude's life is just insane. The other driver at Alfa Romeo is Antonio Giovinazzi. He's a sort of perpetual runner-up figure in the junior formulas prior to his call-up to Alfa Romeo. He actually got called up back in 2017 as a temporary replacement at Sauber for Pascal Wehrlein when Pascal Wehrlein was injured. However, 2019, last year, was just his first full season on the grid, and it was almost his last, actually, after a crash on the last lap of the Belgian GP at Spa. Apparently, there were internal conversations and very tough conversations about Giovinazzi's role at the team following that. He does have sort of a reputation, I guess, of crashing, not dissimilar to another driver that we're going to cover in this episode. However, he picked up in the second half of the season last year. He accrued some solid points at various races, and he stayed out of trouble. All that being said, though, his seat at Alfa Romeo this year is, I think, widely agreed to be more or less his last year, depending on who can make the jump from Formula 2 in terms of the other Ferrari young drivers. I'll be covering Formula 2 in another episode, but right now Giovinazzi's role in the grand scheme of things is more or less just to keep the seat warm until Mick Schumacher can join the team in 2021 or maybe 2022. Moving on from Alfa Romeo, we now turn to Haas, which is the only American team on the grid. Haas is named after its owner, Gene Haas, who also has ownership of a NASCAR team here in the States. They entered F1 back in 2016, and they actually caused a fair bit of controversy when they joined the grid because of their approach to entering the sport. Essentially, more than anyone previously, they sought to source all of their stuff and as much stuff as they can from a partner team, which was Ferrari. This was epitomized most recently in 2018 when they showed up to winter testing, driving what essentially looked like a 2017 Ferrari car. The chassis looked very, very, very similar. They use Ferrari engines, typically from the year previous. Despite all that, though, they're not really a Ferrari B team. They're just a hook, line, and sinker sort of bought-in customer team, essentially. And there's been some concern from other teams on the grid as to what that means for them. When you look at places like McLaren, who source other engines for their stuff but build their own chassis, they see this as putting them at a disadvantage if you can just buy a winning team's chassis. And they're not necessarily wrong, and we've seen this trend sort of develop, actually, with Racing Point, who showed up to winter testing this year with a car that looked a lot like Mercedes' car from last year. Moving on, though, their team principal is Gunther Steiner, and Gunther Steiner actually has a really interesting story. You might recognize him from Netflix's Drive to Survive series. He's the guy with all the expletives saying that they look like wankers. He entered F1 as part of Jaguar's team management back in 2001. Again, to remind you, Jaguar eventually morphed into Red Bull Racing. He popped back up when Red Bull purchased Jaguar from Ford, but was actually squeezed out of the F1 team in pretty short order because Red Bull hired Adrian Newey, which turned out to be a great hire, but not for Gunther Steiner. Instead, they sent Steiner to America, actually. He was to head up the Red Bull effort to create a NASCAR team. And even though that didn't really pan out in the long term, Steiner actually liked America, stayed here, and developed some relationships with other NASCAR people, including Gene Haas. And it's Gunther Steiner that convinced Gene Haas to join Formula One in the first place. Because of that role in introducing Haas to the concept of having a Formula One team, he's been the team principal since the beginning and will likely be the team principal until the end. Unfortunately, that end might be coming soon. I don't want to go too much into specifics, but Gene Haas has definitely made noises in the last couple of years indicating his displeasure at the lack of progress from the team, not through any fault necessarily of the drivers or Gunther Steiner himself, but it's just not the customer model is not a model that would lend itself to actually challenging for championships ever. And if you're not challenging for championships, why are you here? Anyways, moving on to another fixture of Haas Racing, which is Romain Grosjean, a French/Swiss driver. Try saying that a bunch of times fast. Who made his debut back in 2009 with Renault. He raced for Lotus from 2012 to 2015, and then switched over to Haas in 2016 in their inaugural season, and has been there ever since. Romain Grosjean was actually rated pretty highly coming into the sport. He is very quick, and he's still very quick at times. His problem tends to be consistency, and it is punctuated by completely unforced errors, as seen when he crashed at Baku under a safety car.
I think Ericsson hit us.
Nobody hit him. He just lost traction and crashed into a wall while everyone was going slowly. He also received a one-race ban back in 2012 after he caused an enormous pileup at Spa. And last year, and the year previous, if we're honest, was seen pretty commonly crashing into his teammate Kevin Magnussen. To top things off, he actually pushed George Russell into a wall at Singapore last year. So this is a guy that, he's familiar with the physics of crashing a Formula One car into other objects around him Quite honestly, I think if it was any other team, Roman Grosjean would not only have left the team years ago, he probably would have left the sport. I don't know that anybody's in a hurry to hire him. I do think that if Haas were to exit the sport, Grosjean would as well. He is an older figure on the grid. He's been around for a long time, and while he does have a pretty good head for development, he definitely helped steer the car in the appropriate direction, pun intended, last year for Haas. He's getting up there in age, and I don't know that there's any real incentive to keep him around if you're another team looking for a driver. His teammate, though, is a completely different story. Kevin Magnussen, he's the Danish son of former F1 driver Jan Magnussen, who actually still races. He just does sports car stuff these days. Kevin came up through the junior formula as part of the McLaren Young Driver Program and made his debut with McLaren in 2014. He scored a podium in his very first race at Australia that year, but ended up being shoved out of McLaren essentially to make room for Fernando Alonso's second tour with that team, which ended, not great. He took a year off to serve as just a reserve driver at McLaren in 2015, but rejoined the grid with Renault in 2016 before moving to Haas in 2017. He's still pretty young. He's only 27 years old, and he's a lot quicker than I think a lot of people give him credit for. He's known as a very aggressive driver and borderline dangerous driver, though.
Once again, most unsportive driver of the grid.
Suck my balls, mate.
Yeah, you're really good, man.
Pierre Gasly called him the most dangerous driver on the grid, and Leclerc called him stupid last year after incidents with both those drivers. But I think you have to respect somebody who's aggressive in that way and fights for their position, similar to the way that we would respect somebody like Ayrton Senna back in the day, or even Lewis Hamilton today, or Max Verstappen. It's not to put him necessarily in that category. I don't think he's as quick as any of those drivers, but he is a super solid option, and I could see him landing at any number of midfield teams in the future. There was a brief window of time when it looked like he might be able to squeak his way into a Ferrari drive, but with the signing of Sainz over at Ferrari, and that's another phrase, try to say that a bunch of times, I think the door has pretty much closed for Magnussen at top teams. And now we move on to the final team of the grid. We're 9 down, 1 more to go. And unfortunately, this is sort of the team in the saddest sort of scenario right now. And that is, of course, is Williams. Williams is, in the grand scheme of things, it's a lot like McLaren and Ferrari. It's an icon of the Formula One grid. It was founded back in 1977. It's won 114 races, 9 Constructors' Championships, and 7 Drivers' Championships. But all of that glory is long in the past. Their last championship came in 1997. In recent seasons, Williams has comfortably been last on the grid. In fact, last year, in the early stretches of the year, there was some concern that they would even be allowed to race, because there's a rule that says you have to be within, X amount of time of the top team. And they were coming very, very close to not meeting that minimum time. There's been a lot of tumult behind the scenes with their technical directors and their technical direction. Their team principal technically right now is Sir Frank Williams, the founder of the team. But given Frank's advanced age and medical conditions, it's actually the deputy team principal, his daughter Claire, who runs the team day to day. Their driver lineup consists of 2 really young drivers. George Russell, who was a rookie last year, is the F2 champ from 2018. He's a member of the Mercedes Driver Academy. A British driver, he handily beat his teammate last year throughout all of 2019, who was Robert Kubica, who was a former driver considered to be a generational talent until he had a terribly tragic rally car accident. In F2, he beat handily Lando Norris and Alexander Albon, but was rewarded with the worst seat on the grid at Williams. He's still incredibly quick, and during this pandemic, with all of the lockdowns in place and the rise of virtual GPs, George Russell has actually won 3 of them against Charles Leclerc and Lando Norris and Alexander Albon and all of these other sort of really top talents, showing that he still is incredibly quick in any circumstance. He's got to be considered basically a Mercedes driver in waiting. He's just waiting for Hamilton and Bottas to move on. He's in a similar situation to Esteban Ocon, but I personally think that Mercedes might tap Russell before Ocon. They've publicly stated that that's not the case. Toto Wolff has been on the record to say that basically their list for replacements goes Ocon, Russell, and then maybe Vettel if he's around, and then maybe something else. However, I think that leaving Russell languishing in a backmarker team like Williams is going to ultimately stunt his development, and they really need to find him a better seat to drive in. Whether that means moving him into Aston Martin next year or trying to find him a slot at McLaren at some point in the future, both teams with Mercedes relationships, or moving him into Renault once Ocon gets the bump up to Mercedes. They're just going to have to do something for him. Otherwise, he's going to really suffer at Williams because it doesn't look like they're going to be turning it around anytime soon. Finally, last, and if we're perfectly honest, probably least, Nicholas Latifi. Nicholas Latifi is the son of a Canadian billionaire who owes his seat to the amount of money that his dad brings to the team. And if you've heard this story before, it's slightly different. Because unlike Lance Stroll and his dad Lawrence, Latifi has actually never been very successful in junior formula. He's never been really even very competitive. He's got 5 race wins in Formula 2, I believe, to his credit, 4 of them coming last year in a extraordinarily weak Formula 2 field, and he still didn't win the championship there. He placed second. While other drivers like Stroll and Norris have carried the pay driver label, I think Nicholas Latifi is actually the most egregious example of pay drivers in Formula 1, due primarily to his lack of success in the lower tiers of racing. That doesn't mean that he can't be good. I mean, I don't know. All I have to judge off of is 2 years of F2 because that's all I've seen of him, but he has not necessarily impressed there. And then to sort of top everything off, his dad is reported to be the lead in the talks to purchase Williams. Because yes, Williams appears to be up for sale, at least in part, if not in whole. Toto Wolff has reacquired a share in the company, which hopefully makes it a little bit less likely that they come under the ownership of some random Canadian billionaire. But, who knows what the future really holds. So that's it. That's all 10 teams, 20 drivers, and 10 team principals that are on the grid this year. Hopefully that gives you a pretty good grounding and a foundation to start watching the drama unfold as we get started in Austria in July. On the horizon for the show, I've actually got a couple more episodes already sort of in the can. I have a race recap for the IndyCar Genesis 300, which took place in early June. And I've also got a couple of fun Formula 1 episodes, Formula 2, Formula 3 stuff. Lots of stuff to come. As always, I'd love to hear your feedback. Please share it with me. You can head to the openwheel.show on the internet or the openwheelshow.com if you like the longer link. You can also leave a review for this if you like it. If you don't like it, tell me why you didn't like it, and let's see if I can't improve, shall we? If you already like it though, share it with a friend. Word of mouth is the best way for this kind of thing to keep growing. And that about does it for me. I'll catch you on the next time.